very often people, they speak out of turn. And the reason why they speak out of turn, because they don't realize how serious that comment or that remark may be. I mean, here they're demanding something and they feel, they're worthy of certain appointmentships because they have certain distinction. And if you reflect on it and think about it, besides understanding that there's no basis even to what you're saying, the ramifications of what you're saying is something which is heretical. For instance, where it said, when they originally had said it, going back to Pasuk Gimel, Ve'yikolu Moshe ve'Aaron, all the heads of the Sanhedrin, 250 heads of the Sanhedrin, they assembled against Moshe and Aaron, the Yomer Aleim, and they said to them, Rav Lochem, you've taken much. You've taken more than you were supposed to take in terms of appointmentships. Vayomru Aleim, Rav Lochem, ki kol eidu kulu kedoshim, because the whole congregation are all holy people, are all holy. Ubesoch Hashem, and Hashem dwells in our midst. Umadu atisnasa kal Hashem, and why are you lording over the congregation of God? Meaning you're dictating, and therefore you've taken advantage of us. But kulon kadoshim, we're all holy. So Rashi says something interesting. Klom kadoshim, kulam shamu dvorim b'sinai mipi agvura. What makes you more qualified than us? Because Moshe ascended the mountain and he heard the word of Hashem. Therefore, you're more qualified than we are. But they said we all heard the word of Hashem. At Sinai, we all openly prophesied. We prophesied in the wake state. We heard the 10 commandments. Anochi Hashem Elokecho. The first 2 of the 10 commandments they heard. So if that's the case, if we were qualified to hear the 10 commandments directly from Hashem in a wake state, what does it say about who we are? It's clear we're all Kadoshim. So if we're all Kadoshim, we have a qualification, no less than your qualification. If that's the case, why are you lording over us and trying to mislead us and taking everything for yourself and leaving us in the dark? This is what they're saying. Now let's understand. We had read 2 weeks ago how Miriam became a leper. Why did she become a leper? Because she had spoken out of turn about Moshe Rabbeinu. What did she say? She had said, we are prophets as Moshe is a prophet. We never separated from our spouses. Why did Moshe separate from his spouse? That was the comment he made, because when Miriam had heard Tzipporah say, when God passed his spirit from Moshe onto the 70 elders, she said, woe to the wives of these people. Now they're going to have to separate from their wives. They're not going to engage any longer with their wife. Wives, as my husband separated from me after Kabbalah Torah, when we received Torah at Sinai. When Miriam heard that, she wasn't aware of this. She said, why did Moshe separate from his wife? We're no less prophets than he is. And we still have that level of relationship. Why did he choose to do differently? She became a leper. She spoke out of turn. So what did Hashem say to Miriam and to Aaron? Don't you realize there's no comparison between who you are and who he is? He prophesies in a wake state. I communicate directly to him, and with you people, it's only in a sleep state, not the wake state, and so on and so forth. At Sinai, all Jews prophesied in the wake state. Every Jew that was at Sinai, the 600,000 males above the age of 20, and the women and children, when Hashem had spoken to them, they all had prophesied in the wake state. Now, let's understand. The Ramchal writes in the Das Tfunos that a prophet, when Hashem communicates with a prophet, it's an awake state, and Hashem does not communicate through the physical faculty, through the brain. It's directly to the soul. Why? Because since the body is physical and mundane and earthy, the body doesn't have the capacity, because it hasn't been spiritualized, and it has no relevance to the spirituality of the soul. It doesn't have the capacity to receive the communication. So therefore, the communication is directly to the Neshama. And that's the reason why he cites the Chazal that Moshe, that David HaMelech, David was a prophet. He was able to fathom in Torah in a moment what it took other people 100 years to come upon. Now, how do you fathom and understand Torah, which is the equivalent of 100 years of immersion? So he explains, because since the communication is to the Neshama, in the spiritual world, it's not a finite world. It's unlimited. So therefore, a moment is the equivalent, what you could put into a moment, you could put into thousands of years. Therefore, David was able to understand and come upon truths which would take other people 100 years to come upon, because it was a direct communication to the Neshama. That's the Ramchal. But it can't be the body. Why not the body? Because the body doesn't have the capacity to receive that level of communication. Because the body is finite, its limit has great limitation. However, Moshe Rabbeinu, because he had spiritualized his physicality to the point that it was at the level of his neshama, there was a full integration between the soul and the body. Therefore, Moshe Rabbeinu, even the wake state, was qualified to prophesy even in a wake state for that reason. This was the difference between Moshe Rabbeinu and any other prophet. So Hashem could prophesy directly with him, even in a wake state, within the context of his physicality, because there's a full integration between his neshama and the body. That was the difference. The Ramchal writes that even a Navi, when he prophesies in a sleep state, the intensity of the connection is to such a degree that Hashem has to put the person on life support, otherwise he would die. The neshama would actually detach itself from the body. So as a result of that, even when he communicates with the neshama reaches such a level of spirituality. As a result of that, he has to be put on life support. So why at Sinai did every Jew prophesy in a wake state if they weren't qualified? Because their physicality was not at that level. So he explains, so the Siforno explains that understanding what prophecy is and can be connected to Hashem in that level, it's not survivable whatsoever. So how could Moshe prophesy at that level? It's an impossibility. So Hashem wanted every Jew to prophesy in that context, in a wake state, to understand that if Hashem willed something, it's possible. So every Jew in a wake state saw how Hashem was communicating openly with Moshe in a wake state to transmit what he's receiving, to transmit to the Jewish people. But once that was established, for the sake of them understanding Moshe's level, then they went back to an ordinary level. No prophet from that moment going forward ever prophesied in a wake state, only in a sleep state. So that they had heard the 10 commandments in a wake state was only to establish Moshe to be that special person. And they have it backwards. Why are you taking it all for yourself? Kumanu Kadoshim. We're all holy, because at Sinai, we ourselves prophesied as you prophesied. We were in a wake state. We heard the 10 commandments, but they didn't get it. You only prophesied in the wake state to appreciate who Moshe Rabbeinu is. As they said, they had it backwards. But they said, if that's the case, Kumon Kadoshim, if we have that qualification, so why are you better than we are? Why are you taking all the distinctions and all the appointmentships for yourself? Why are you lording over us? Paul writes that a prophet, even if some prophets prophesy once in a lifetime. And even when they prophesy once in a lifetime, it may have been for a moment. But that moment of experiencing prophecy, from that moment going forward, they were a different dimension of human being. That experience was such a life-changing experience. His understanding of reality in every aspect of his existence was different because he was touched by God. Even though it was through the soul, doesn't make a difference. Hashem could have communicated everything, and they could have prophesied what was happening with Moshe in a sleep state. But they would have been short-sighted because they would have understood what's happening. What Moshe and the way he prophesies isn't a possibility. He's misleading us. So for them to understand that he's not misleading them, that's his reality. As a result of that, they'll embrace exactly who Moshe is at Sinai because they themselves experienced that same experience. But then they're going to revert back and understand that they're not Moshe Rabbeinu. And supposedly the takeaway was supposed to be, they're only brought to that level to have that glimpse to appreciate who Moshe Rabbeinu was. Rather than having that understanding, they didn't understand. They believed that they're no less qualified. So if that's the case, Moshe, why are you calling the shot, so to say? Why are you dictating? It's interesting. We find, but they should have understood. They reverted back to a sleep state. Moshe Rabbeinu did not. So what if you prophesize for the moment? We find by the plague of blood, right? It was the first of the 10 Makos. Moshe Rabbeinu says to Paro that if you don't send the Jews out, all the water in Egypt will turn to blood. That's what he said. And sure enough, it turned to blood. And the Egyptians had nothing to drink. And the only water they were able to have is only if they purchased the water from the Jews. And that's what Chazal, the Medrash, tells us that the first time the Jews became wealthy was through the plague of the blood, because the only way the Egyptian is able to have water to drink was only if he paid for it. If he would just take it from the Jew, it remained blood. And even if the Jew was drinking water and he put a straw in the cup of the Jew, in the glass of the Jew was sipping out of that cup water, and the Egyptian was sipping blood. So unless he paid for the water, it remained blood. Okay? What did Paro say? So they went and purchased the water from the Jew, and Paro said, through his sorcerers, they were the most advanced sorcerers in the world, they took the water they purchased from Moshe and they turned it into blood. They said, we can do the same thing. You're misleading us. This is sorcery. We're not impressed. But when Moshe Rabbeinu said there's going to be a plague of blood, he said, and the fish in the Nile will die. That's what he said. Not only would the water turn to blood, the fish in the Nile will die. What do you have to add that little piece of information? It's understood. Only fish could live in water. They can't live in blood. So over there, if you take a look in the Sefarno, on those words, witchcraft only creates a visual reality, but in its essence, in its chemical makeup, it's still H2O. The only one who's able to change something into another reality, another essence, another makeup, is only Hashem. So therefore, even if the water would look like blood, would have the viscosity of blood and everything, it smelled like blood, but its chemical makeup is to H2O. So if that's the case, fish could live in that. So by Moshe Rabbeinu adding that little piece of information, and the fish will die, that means the only one who could do that is only Hashem himself. Change the reality, the molecular makeup of that entity, it's no longer H2O. If that's the case, the fish are going to die. So if that's the case, it's obvious. What the magicians are doing through sorcery is not what Moshe is doing. The plague of blood is the hand of Hashem. There's direct divine intervention. But Paro says, something, it doesn't make a difference. We can do what you're doing. But what happened now is is not what your magicians are doing. It's close enough, it doesn't make a difference. You understand? If you don't want to see the difference, you don't see the difference. It doesn't have that impact on you. Klal Yisrael said, what did you take all the distinctions for yourself? Why are you lording over us? We also prophesied, awake state. Don't you understand this difference? You reverted back, even the ones who were prophets, to a sleep state. Moshe Rabbeinu remained on the wake state level. But they said it doesn't make a difference. But if we were qualified there, we heard the 10 commandments in a wake state, Kulana Kadoshim, if that's the case, why are you lording us over us? Every one of us has relevance to the distinctions, to those levels of appointmentship. Question. Respond. Go ahead. Ask the question again.
Was there any indication that Korach and his group wanted to continue hearing the 10 commandments after the Jewish people said after the first 2 commandments, we don't want to hear any more, Moshe, you be our emissary?
Now, Korach, very often when a person has an axe to grind, he doesn't come and make the claim, it's me, it's I. Usually influences others, and he says it's us, because otherwise it's obvious he's coming here for himself. He couldn't care less about anybody but himself. See, his other people joining his claim only to support his claim, and he's concealed within that group. But really, he's leading the pack, and he really his concern is not for anybody but himself, as we saw with the fire pans. Korach knew there was a 251 chance to 1 chance that he was going to survive. And Korach knew this, because Korach had seen, as it says, his eye misled him, that Shmuel HaNavi, who was the equivalent of Moshe and Aaron, will be his descendant. Therefore, he believed he'd be the lone survivor. But what about all the 150 people are going to die? Korach couldn't care less, because when you believe in a cause, you say, it's worthwhile 250 people to die for the sake of truth, that I should be the leader. And confirming that I'm right, because Shmuel HaNavi is going to be my descendant. So the 250 people is not even a question. They did not prophesy in a wake state. They did not. Why particularly the 250 heads of people qualified to be the heads of Sanhedrin? Because these people themselves were in leadership positions. That's where he took them. So if we are leaders, we're qualified to be the head of the Sanhedrin. That means we have all the qualifications for leadership. So if that's the case, Kulana Kadoshim, why did you take it for yourself? That's number one. And I believe that nobody, again, if the purpose was only to give them a glimpse of Moshe Rabbeinu, the moment they heard the first 2, they said it's too much for us, including Korach, because in reality, they weren't there. They weren't there. But it does make a difference. But that's not enough of a reason that we should be disqualified, because we do have that capacity. It's interesting. We had said by the vestments, when Moshe Rabbeinu was told that they should make vestments for Aaron and his children to officiate in the Mishkan, you should make vestments l'kavod u'tiferes, for kavod, for honor and for glory. So when they officiate, so the Kohen Gadol has 8 vestments, the ordinary Kohen wears 4 vestments. And the Kohen Gadol, if he officiates without the 8, his service is not valid. And the ordinary Kohen, the common Kohen, if he officiates with 4, it's valid. If not, it's not a valid service. They need those vestments to be worn exactly as prescribed by Hashem, so they should be qualified to officiate. The Gemara in Avodah Zarah asks a question. We find that the Kohanim were installed on the 8th day, and that's when Aaron and his children began officiating. But for the first 7 days, before it was finally inaugurated on the 8th day, Moshe Rabbeinu officiated. For 7 days, every day he would assemble the Mishkan, dismantle it, officiate every day. So the Gemara says, they asked Rabbi Akiva, what did Moshe wear when he officiated? Did he wear vestments, priestly vestments, or did he wear something else? So they asked, Rabbi Akiva didn't know, so he went and asked in the Beis Medrash, and they had said to him, to Rabbi Akiva, that Moshe wore a white tunic. Beged Lovon, a white tunic. He did not wear priestly vestments. So we mentioned then, if you remember, the Shalach Kodesh explains that before the Chet of Adam Rishon, for Adam ate of the tree of knowledge, what was meant to be the vestment to serve Hashem? The body was the vestment. The Neshama is the essence of the person, but you can only actualize and facilitate God's will if you have a physicality. So the physicality of the human being is the vestment of the Neshama, of the soul. What happened when Adam had ingested the fruit that is Tov v'Ra, that it has absolute evenly? That means the vestment became putrefied. Once the vestment became putrefied, the body was no longer qualified to be the vestment to serve Hashem. Therefore, when it came to Kabbalah Torah, and Hashem says, make for me a Mishkan, a Migdosh, a sanctuary, I'll dwell in your midst. Now they have to officiate, but factually speaking, this is post-Chet, Egel, which they've reverted back to post-sin. The body has that putrefied element. So if you officiate, you need a vestment. Aaron and his children were not qualified. So he needed a vestment to compensate for the body. So the vestment, the way it was made exactly prescribed by Hashem, that vestment was the equivalent of the body pre-sin. So Moshe Rabbeinu, he had spiritualized his body to such a degree that his body didn't have the putrefied status. He was able to officiate in the original vestment which God created, which is his body. So he only wore a white tunic, beged lovon, only to cover his nakedness, because it's not appropriate. But in terms of vestment, his body was the vestment. That's Moshe Rabbeinu. And because his body was at that level, therefore he was able to prophesy in the wake state. Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve, before the sin of eating the tree of knowledge, Hashem spoke to them when in a wake state. They weren't in a sleep state. It was only post-sin that they were no longer qualified. That's when it went to a sleep state. That's what happened. So don't you understand the difference? They didn't understand the difference. Because when you get riled up and you believe that you misled, and Moshe misled you, then you don't see the forest from the trees. You don't see the nuances of difference, as Paro didn't see the difference between what his sources were able to bring about and the blood, the water turning to blood that Hashem had caused to come about. The blood that Hashem brought about, the fish will die in that blood. In Paro's blood, which comes through sorcery, the fish live. But it doesn't make a difference. Because we could also turn water into blood. And that's the way people are. Question again.
If the lesson to be derived from Korach is the blindness that somebody can do unto themselves, why does the Torah need to have an expansive treatment of the rebellion of Korach?
Okay, now, we had mentioned that when we left Egypt, we left with tremendous wealth. Every Jew, I had mentioned the Gemara, had taken minimally 10 pack animals laden with gold and silver, which they borrowed from the Egyptians. And that was the promise to Avram Avinu, that after the lengthy exile, which will be afflicted through that bondage, that was the Ruchush Godel, that was the great wealth we left with. So the Gemara tells us in Sanhedrin that Korach, when he left Egypt with over 300 pack animals, just carrying the keys to the vaults where he stored that wealth when he left Egypt. So the Gemara asks, where did he come upon such wealth? So the Gemara tells us that Yosef, being the viceroy of Egypt, he gathered all the wealth of the world. And he had stored the wealth which Egypt had at 3 locations. As Korach was leaving Egypt, all of a sudden, the ground opened up, and he came upon one of those locations. And that's what he took with him. And therefore, the Gemara tells us, in the history of existence, there was no Jew ever as wealthy as Korach. And there was no Gentile is wealthy as Odom, as Haman or Russia, who was the viceroy of the Persian Empire. But that's how we came upon it. So I asked the question. It's clear from Chazal, the only reason why Korach was able to seduce these 250 people, it wasn't only because he had pedigree, not only because he had charisma, and not only because he was phenomenally intelligent, was because he had wealth, which was one of a kind of wealth. When a person has that kind of wealth, you have a certain status and persona, which is almost, you can't resist, you can't stand up against it. So why did Hashem give him that kind of wealth? So we explained that what Korach was saying, that this is not the word of Hashem, but Moshe Rabbeinu had fabricated this question eventually would be brought up again. That question has to be put to rest. That Moshe emes Torah emes. Once and forever, that question will never ever be asked again. Hashem had given Korach the opportunity to make that choice because he had every qualification of leadership, pedigree, everything. I will give you that wealth, and because you have this inflated ego and you can't swallow it, through you, it's going to be confirmed, Moshe emes Torah emes. And as a result of the earth opening up its mouth, swallowing him, his community, and all the wealth, that will confirm that the word of Moshe is the word of Hashem. It's not Moshe Rabbeinu had created his own narrative and he pulled the wool over the eyes of the Jews. Not at all. That's why it was worth everything in the world, because this would be a lingering question till the end of time. Therefore, the question had to be put to rest, never again to be brought up again. That's why we have such a lengthy recording of this back and forth of what this was the most serious moment in the history of Klal Yisrael, because the basis for Judaism is the word of Hashem. And the moment it's questioned, it may not be the word of Hashem. It's no different than any other language, any other religion. Every other religion is a man-made religion. You come upon it, it makes sense, it's this, it's that. Judaism is irrefutably the word of Hashem. Every nuance of our behavior, of what we do, our performance is all bound because that's what Hashem had dictated without a question. That was only confirmed beyond doubt at this moment through the confrontation Korach and his community and Moshe Rabbeinu. That's why this is so important.
Understood. So in some respects, you feel bad for Korach, right? He was the vehicle through which this took place. And I guess you're saying to the extent that he opted to make the right choice, meaning to relegate his ego to a lower level, this question would have been resolved in some other manner?
Correct. But you realize God knows when God does anything, he sees from the beginning till the end.
Well, this is my point. So he's
just an example. A person has to be victimized. Hashem knows this person, what choice he's going to make. As I said, this is a basic question. People ask a question. If God knows the future, if that's the case, does the person have free choice? Because God knows you're going to sin. Does the person have free choice? Is that a valid question? The answer is no. God knows everybody has choice, but because God is in the future, not only knows the future, God knows what your choice is going to be. So if that's going to be your choice, if that's the case, God makes the shidduch. He puts the victimizer with the victim. The person deserves to be victimized because he needs atonement. God knows this man, that is who he is. So because the man made his own choice, he puts them together. Korach is the person who will choose because of his ego to destroy the world for his own sake, for his own glory. Therefore, Korach was chosen to be the one. God's not denying him anything because that's exactly who Korach is. Therefore, Korach has all the qualities and the qualifications to bring this to closure that Moshe emes and Torah emes.
So does Korach have a share in the world to come?
No. The Mishnah says in Sanhedrin, Korach does not have a share in the world to come.
So he died unatoned.
Correct? He went straight down. I mentioned the Gemara in Bava Basra yesterday, I think, or 2 days ago, maybe another class, that an Arab goes over to one of the Amoroim and says to him, Rabbi, I want to show you something very interesting. And he takes the rabbi out into the desert and he shows him a fissure in the ground that smoke is coming out of the ground. And he takes his spear and he takes a clump of fleece, puts it to the tip of the spear and puts it into the crevice, into the fissure in the ground, and it gets burnt, it gets singed. And then he says to him, put your ear to the ground. You'll hear something which I don't understand what's being said. And he hears people chanting, Moshe emes v'toroso emes, v'anachnu badoim. Moshe is truthful, his Torah is truthful, and we are liars. And the Gemara says this is Korach and his congregation in hell, in Gehenna, chanting this unceasingly.
That's not true.
That's what Korach, and this is talking about literally 1,500 years after the incident of Korach. They're still burning in hell. They have no share in the world to come.
That's not tshuva when you do it, when you say that.
So when you're in hell, when a person, God forbid, is in hell, it's too late.
Well, but you're still recognizing.
But even though you recognize, the Gemara says in Gittin that Onkelos is the Aramaic commentary on the Torah. He was the nephew of the Roman emperor, and he converted to Judaism. Before he converted, through, I don't know exactly the word that's used, he was able to raise 3 people from Gehenna to consult with them. One of the people he raised was Bilam HaRosha. Bilam, who's burning in hell. And it says Bilam is burning in Shichva Zera Rosachas, in semen, which is boiling hot, because he's the one who actually had convinced Balak that he should have the Moabite women seduce the men. And 40,000 Jews died in the plague because of that, with the Balpor. So he says to him, should I convert? The man is burning in hell. And it says only because that was a result of what he had introduced, how the Jews had sinned. So he says, not only should you not convert, whatever you could do to hurt the Jewish people, just hurt them. Yeah, the man is burning in hell, and he hasn't changed his position. Then he brings up Yeshu. This is, the founder of Christianity. And he says, what should I convert? And where's he? He's burning in hot feces. Why feces? So the Gemara says, because a person who makes a mockery and misinterprets the Torah, they will feed him that. He deserves to be fed that. So that's his fare. He says, should I convert? He says, don't start up with the Jews. You're going to get hurt. And not only that, it's a good idea you should convert. It would be to your advantage. And because of this dialogue you have with these people in Gehenna, each one experiencing a different type of Gehenna, due to his past life, he converted. And that's Uncle Sager. So the question is, if you're in Gehenna, you're burning there, and so on and so forth. Once you didn't come to a level of understanding of what truth is, what not truth is. So that's even more here in hell. They see truth. So because they see truth at this irrefutable level, what are they saying? Moshe emes, Torah emes. That they're in hell is because they haven't been atoned. The sin, the breach of what they tried to bring about was so severe and so serious, it's unatonable. And therefore, forever, they're going to burn in hell. They have no share in the world to come for that reason.
It was Yeshu, it was Bilam, and the third one was Korach. Who did?
Or before speaking about the question which you're asking, we find the Rambam says, and I mentioned this Rambam in Hilchos Yesodei Torah. He says that what is the basis for the authenticity of Torah? Well, Moshe Rabbeinu is the one who communicated the Torah to us. But how do we know Moshe is God's spokesman? Was it because he brought the 10 plagues upon Egypt? Was it because he split the sea? Because he brought us manna in the Midbar, which sustained us for 40 years? The Rambam says no. Because anybody whose belief is based on miracles, it's considered fickle. Why is it fickle? Because somebody could come and say, although you believed it was miracle, maybe Moshe Rabbeinu was a greater sorcerer than even the sorcerers in Egypt. And all along, he was pulling the wool over your eyes. And all that he had done in the desert was all sorcery, that he was able to bring about A through Z. Therefore, as a result of that, since the Torah has to be established irrefutably, its authenticity, that it's beyond doubt at any level, that it's the word of Hashem, therefore, God openly communicated with Moshe in the presence of every Jew at Sinai. As a result of that, they understand Moshe is God's spokesman, that the word of Moshe is the word of Hashem. Those are the words of Rambam. So you see, even regarding Moshe's originally, why did God openly speak to Moshe in the presence of every Jew in the wake state? Because anything less than that, there's this lingering question, even though you believe the truth, but it has to be uncontestable forever. That nobody should ever be able to broach that question. Maybe Moshe Rabbeinu was a greater sorcerer than everyone who ever existed. But even there, they said, we understand. But we ourselves, we also prophesize in the wake state. That's where Korach's coming with his group. And therefore, we understand you're qualified, but why don't you take it all for yourselves? Is that what God really wanted? It's interesting. What did Hashem say to Miriam after she had spoken out of turn about Moshe Rabbeinu? It says over there, Hashem openly states, and Moshe is the most humble person who ever walked the face of the earth. Moshe Rabbeinu says, Nachnu Mo. There wasn't a trace of ego in Moshe Rabbeinu, not a trace. So if that's the case, you mean he took it all for himself? You'd say a person has some level of ego. You say, you know something? We could talk about nepotism. We could talk about conflict of interest. But if Hashem himself attested to the fact there's no more humble person than Moshe in the history of existence, who ever walked the face of the earth, that he's basing them on his most faithful servant, is it possible to say for a moment that to accuse him of nepotism? But despite all that, when you have that conflict of interest, God said it, but whatever it is, everybody sees it through his own lens.
I mean, Rabbi, no, just the last.
What set off Korach? Because a cousin of his who was the son of a younger brother, was given an appointmentship that he felt he deserved. Okay? This appointmentship did not happen now, it happened earlier. So what took Korach so long to start rattling his saber? So the Ramban answers, Korach was waiting for the moment where Moshe, his prominence is tarnished. Prichet Meraglim, the Jews, anybody who would actually question or accuse Moshe of anything, that person would be stoned. He'd be silenced and shunned immediately. This is the first time after the Chet Meraglim that Moshe did not go to bat for the Jewish people, because factually they were condemned to die over a 40-year period. So there's a certain degree of, there was like this cloud hanging over Moshe Rabbeinu's head. His popularity was diminished. Korach says, now's the time to go for the jugular vein. Now Moshe Rabbeinu is vulnerable. That's why he waited till this moment. Before, Ramban says they would have stoned Korach and anybody who would dare ever to question Moshe Rabbeinu. But now that the people are into this melancholy state, because they're all dying, anybody between the age of above the age of 20, now's the time to show that Moshe is not that perfect. And as a result of that, he thought he'd get away with this. So he was biding his time for this moment.